The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her gear one final time. At 24, she had already proven herself in ways most people never would, but today felt different. Today, she was training alongside Navy SEALs for the first time as part of a joint military exercise. The weight of being the only woman in the group pressed on her shoulders, but she had carried heavier burdens before. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Texas where her father ran a martial arts academy. From the age of 5, she had been learning disciplines that most people only saw in movies. Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and traditional boxing had shaped her into someone who could handle herself in any situation. But more than the physical training, her father had taught her something invaluable: how to stay calm when everything around her was falling apart. The other soldiers looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She was used to this reaction. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches with a lean but muscular build, Sarah didn't look like what most people expected from someone with her background. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her brown eyes held a steady confidence that came from years of proving herself. "All right, listen up," barked Sergeant Williams, the exercise coordinator. "Today we're running a combat simulation. You'll be moving through hostile territory, extracting a wounded teammate, and making it to the extraction point. This isn't a game. Treat it like your life depends on it, because someday it might." The team was divided into 2 groups. Sarah found herself paired with 6 Navy SEALs, including a medic named Jack Thompson who kept giving her sideways glances. She could see the doubt in his eyes. He was probably wondering what a regular soldier was doing in their advanced training exercise. Jack was everything Sarah expected from a SEAL medic. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that came from saving lives under fire. His sandy brown hair was cropped short, and his blue eyes seemed to take in everything around him. He had been a medic for 8 years and had served 3 tours overseas. To him, Sarah was just another soldier who might become a liability when things got tough. The simulation began with their team moving through a mock village constructed for training purposes. The buildings were realistic enough to feel authentic, complete with narrow alleyways and multiple floors. Sarah moved with her team, staying in formation and keeping her eyes open for threats. She had studied the layout during their briefing and had already identified 3 potential escape routes and 2 defensive positions. Everything was going smoothly until they reached the center of the village. That's when the simulated attack began. Blank rounds cracked through the air as opposing forces opened fire from multiple directions. The team scattered, taking cover behind concrete barriers and walls. "Contact left! Contact left!" shouted one of the SEALs as he returned fire. Sarah pressed herself against a wall, her heart racing but her mind clear. This was what her father had trained her for: chaos, confusion, and the need to think clearly under pressure. She identified the source of the heaviest fire and began planning a flanking maneuver that would allow her team to neutralize the threat. But then something went wrong. As Sarah moved to communicate her plan to the team leader, a malfunction occurred with one of the simulation devices. What was supposed to be a harmless flashbang simulator exploded with unexpected force, sending debris flying in all directions. Sarah felt the impact before she heard the sound. A piece of metal struck her left shoulder with tremendous force, spinning her around and sending her crashing into a concrete wall. Pain shot through her body like electricity, and she could feel warm blood seeping through her uniform. The simulation had suddenly become very real. For a moment, everything went silent except for the ringing in her ears. She could see her teammates shouting, but their voices seemed to come from far away. Jack was already moving toward her, his medical training kicking in automatically. "Man down! Real casualty!" Jack yelled as he reached Sarah's position. Sarah tried to push herself up, but her left arm wouldn't respond properly. The pain was intense, but what bothered her more was the look she saw in Jack's eyes. It was the look she had seen countless times before, the assumption that she was helpless, that she couldn't handle the situation. "Don't move," Jack said firmly as he began his assessment. "You've taken a significant impact to the shoulder. Possible fracture, definite soft tissue damage." Sarah gritted her teeth against the pain and looked Jack directly in the eyes. "I'm fine. Just patch me up so we can continue the exercise." Jack stared at her in disbelief. "You're not fine. You need immediate medical attention. This exercise is over for you." But Sarah was already working through the pain, using techniques her father had taught her years ago. Pain was just information, he used to say. It tells you something is wrong, but it doesn't have to control you. She began to focus on her breathing, slowing her heart rate and redirecting her body's response to the injury. "I said I'm fine," Sarah repeated, this time with such conviction that Jack paused in his treatment. The other SEALs had formed a defensive perimeter around them. But they were all watching the interaction between Sarah and their medic. They had seen tough soldiers before, but there was something different about the way Sarah was handling her injury. Jack quickly examined the wound. It was bad, a deep laceration that would definitely need stitches, and the shoulder was likely dislocated. Under normal circumstances, this would be an immediate evacuation situation. But they were in the middle of a training exercise, miles from the nearest medical facility. "We need to call for extraction," Jack said to the team leader. Sarah grabbed Jack's arm with her good hand. "No, give me 5 minutes." "5 minutes for what?" Jack asked, genuinely confused. Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes and began a series of controlled breathing exercises that seemed completely out of place in a combat zone. Jack watched in fascination as her face relaxed, and her breathing became deep and rhythmic. What Jack didn't know was that Sarah was using a technique called combat breathing that she had learned not just in the military but from years of martial arts training. But more than that, she was accessing a mental state that allowed her to compartmentalize pain and fear. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 2 minutes, Sarah opened her eyes. They were clearer now, more focused. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled her actions. "My shoulder is dislocated," she said calmly. "I need you to help me relocate it." Jack shook his head. "That's not happening. Shoulder relocations require proper medical facilities and pain management." Sarah looked at him with a small smile. "Trust me on this one?" Before Jack could protest further, Sarah positioned herself against the wall and, using a technique she had learned in her martial arts training, managed to pop her shoulder back into place with a sickening click. The pain was enormous for about 3 seconds, and then it began to subside to a manageable level. Jack stared at her in complete shock. In all his years as a medic, he had never seen someone relocate their own shoulder in the field, especially not while maintaining that level of composure. "Now," Sarah said as she tested her range of motion, "can you bandage this cut so we can finish the mission?" The other SEALs were equally amazed. They had seen tough soldiers before. But Sarah's level of pain tolerance and medical knowledge was something entirely different. Jack found himself automatically reaching for his medical supplies. Professional instinct took over as he cleaned and bandaged Sarah's wound, but his mind was racing with questions. Who was this woman, and where had she learned to handle trauma like this? "You know," Jack said as he worked, "that was either very brave or very stupid." Sarah managed a laugh despite the pain. "In my experience, those two things are often the same." As Jack finished the bandaging, he couldn't help but notice how Sarah had positioned herself. Even injured, she was still maintaining situational awareness, watching for threats and keeping track of her team's positions. This wasn't the behavior of someone in shock or someone who was overwhelmed by their injury. "All right," said the team leader. "We're calling for extraction. Sarah needs proper medical attention." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We're going to finish this exercise." The team leader looked at Jack, who was clearly torn between his medical training and his growing respect for Sarah's determination. "The mission isn't over," Sarah continued. In a real situation, you wouldn't have the luxury of calling for extraction every time someone gets hurt. This is exactly the kind of scenario we're training for. Jack found himself nodding reluctantly. She was right, and they all knew it. In real combat situations, medics had to make difficult decisions about who could continue fighting and who needed immediate evacuation. "Can you handle a weapon?" Jack asked. Sarah picked up her rifle with her good arm and performed a quick function check. Her movements were slower than before, but they were still precise and confident. "I can handle whatever you need me to handle." The team leader made the decision to continue, but he moved Sarah to a support position where she would be less likely to encounter direct combat. Jack stayed close to her, partly to monitor her condition, and partly because he was genuinely curious to see how she would perform. As they moved through the rest of the simulation, Jack watched Sarah carefully. Despite her injury, she maintained perfect tactical awareness. She spotted threats that other team members missed, and her movement was still fluid and purposeful. Whatever training she had received, it was far beyond what most soldiers experienced. The exercise continued for another 2 hours, with the team successfully completing their objectives. Sarah performed flawlessly despite her injury, and by the end of the simulation, she had earned the quiet respect of every SEAL on the team. As they gathered for debriefing, Jack approached Sarah privately. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong." Sarah shrugged, then winced as the movement aggravated her injury. "Most people do. I'm used to it." "Where did you learn to handle pain like that?" Jack asked. "And how did you know how to relocate your own shoulder?" Sarah looked at him for a moment, deciding how much to reveal. "I've been training since I was 5 years old. My father taught me that your mind is more powerful than your body, but only if you know how to use it." Jack was intrigued, but could tell that there was much more to the story. As they prepared to head back to base, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something extraordinary. Sarah wasn't just tough. She was operating on a completely different level than anyone he had ever worked with. The ride back to base was quiet, with each team member processing what they had experienced. Sarah sat in the back of the transport vehicle, her injury throbbing but her spirits high. She had proven herself once again, but more importantly, she had gained the respect of some of the most elite soldiers in the military. Jack sat across from her, stealing glances and trying to figure out what made her so different. He had worked with hundreds of soldiers over the years, but none of them had demonstrated the combination of physical toughness, mental discipline, and tactical awareness that Sarah possessed. As they pulled into the base, Sarah caught Jack looking at her. "Something on your mind, Doc?" Jack smiled. "Yeah, actually. I was wondering if you'd be interested in having dinner sometime. I'd like to hear more about this training of yours." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is that your professional medical opinion?" "No," Jack said with a grin. "That's just a guy who's impressed and wants to get to know you better." Sarah considered this for a moment. She had always been cautious about getting involved with fellow soldiers, but there was something about Jack that intrigued her. Maybe it was the way he had treated her with respect once he realized what she was capable of. "All right," she said finally. "But I picked the restaurant, and you're buying since you doubted me earlier." Jack laughed. "Deal." As they stepped off the transport, neither of them realized that their story was just beginning. The injury that had brought them together was about to reveal secrets about Sarah's past that would change both of their lives forever. 3 days later, Sarah sat across from Jack in a small Italian restaurant off base, her left arm still in a sling, but her spirits remarkably high. Jack had spent those 3 days thinking about what he had witnessed during the training exercise, and the more he thought about it, the more questions he had. "So," Jack said as they waited for their food, "are you going to tell me where you really learned to handle pain like that? Because what I saw the other day wasn't standard military training." Sarah smiled and took a sip of her water. You really want to know? I'm genuinely curious. In 8 years as a medic, I've never seen anyone relocate their own shoulder and then continue a mission like nothing happened. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering how much to share. She had always been private about her background, partly because it sounded unbelievable, and partly because it attracted the wrong kind of attention. My father owns a martial arts academy in Texas, she began. But it's not your typical dojo. He trains people who need to know how to handle themselves in extreme situations. Jack raised an eyebrow. What kind of people? Security contractors, law enforcement, military personnel on leave who want advanced training, but also regular people who have found themselves in dangerous situations and want to make sure it never happens again. Sarah's voice became quieter as she continued. When I was 7, my mother was killed in a home invasion. 3 men broke into our house while my father was at work. My mother tried to protect me, but... Jack felt his chest tighten. I'm sorry. You don't have to continue if you don't want to. Sarah shook her head. It's okay. I've made peace with it. But that event changed everything for my father. He had always taught martial arts, but after that night he became obsessed with teaching people how to survive anything. The waiter brought their food, but neither of them touched it immediately. Jack was absorbed in Sarah's story, and Sarah was lost in memories she rarely shared. From that day forward, my training became intense, Sarah continued. My father taught me that fear and pain are just information. They tell you something about your situation, but they don't have to control your actions. That's a heavy burden for a child, Jack observed. Maybe, but it also gave me something that most people never have. Complete confidence in my ability to handle whatever life throws at me. Jack began to understand. The breathing techniques, the pain management, the way you stayed calm under fire, that all came from this training? Sarah nodded. My father studied everything. Military combatives, police defensive tactics, medical field care, psychological warfare techniques. But more than that, he studied the mind. He believed that mental toughness could overcome almost any physical limitation. And he taught all of this to you? Every day from the time I was 7 until I enlisted at 18. Combat breathing, stress inoculation, pain redirection, tactical thinking under pressure. By the time I was 16, I was helping him teach classes to grown men who thought they were tough until they met me. Jack was starting to get a picture of who Sarah really was. That's why you weren't impressed by the SEALs. You've been training with elite operators your whole life. Sarah laughed. Don't get me wrong, those guys are incredibly skilled, but intensity doesn't intimidate me anymore. I've been living with it since I was a child. Their conversation was interrupted when Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. That's strange. My commanding officer wants to see me tomorrow morning. Says it's about the training exercise. Sarah felt a familiar knot form in her stomach. She had hoped that her performance during the exercise would go unnoticed by higher command. But apparently, that wasn't the case. The next morning, Jack reported to Colonel Morrison's office as requested. The colonel was a career officer with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, who had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. Sit down, Thompson, the colonel said without looking up from a thick file on his desk. Jack took a seat and waited. He had no idea why he had been called in, but the serious tone suggested it wasn't a social visit. Tell me about the training exercise 3 days ago, the colonel said, finally looking up. Specifically, tell me about Sergeant Martinez. Jack carefully recounted the events of the exercise, focusing on Sarah's injury and her remarkable response to it. As he spoke, he noticed the colonel taking notes and occasionally nodding. In your professional medical opinion, the colonel asked when Jack finished, what was unusual about Sergeant Martinez's behavior? Jack thought carefully before answering. Sir, in my 8 years as a medic, I've never seen anyone demonstrate that level of pain tolerance and tactical thinking while seriously injured. Her medical knowledge was also far beyond standard military training. The colonel opened the file on his desk and handed Jack several photographs. They were surveillance photos of a young woman taking down multiple attackers in what appeared to be a parking garage. This was taken 6 months ago in San Antonio, the colonel said. 3 men attempted to assault a woman in a parking garage. The woman neutralized all 3 attackers using techniques that our analysts couldn't immediately identify. Jack studied the photos. The woman's face wasn't clearly visible, but her build and movement patterns looked familiar. The interesting thing, the colonel continued, is that the woman disappeared before police arrived. No charges were filed because the attackers refused to press charges and claimed they had been mugged by a gang. The colonel handed Jack another set of photos. This was 4 months ago in Dallas. A convenience store robbery went wrong when one of the customers intervened. The customer disarmed 2 gunmen and held them until police arrived. Again, the photos showed a woman whose face wasn't clear but whose movements were distinctive. And this, the colonel said, producing a 3rd set of photos, was 2 months ago outside Fort Hood. A drunk soldier was harassing a female officer in the parking lot. Before military police could respond, someone intervened. Jack looked at all the photos together and felt a chill of recognition. Sir, are you suggesting that Sergeant Martinez— I'm not suggesting anything, Thompson. I'm telling you that our intelligence analysts have identified Sergeant Martinez as the common factor in all 3 incidents. Jack stared at the photos, his mind racing. The woman in the pictures moved with the same fluid efficiency he had witnessed during the training exercise. Why are you showing me this, sir? The colonel leaned back in his chair. Because, Thompson, Sergeant Martinez is not who she appears to be. Her father doesn't just run a martial arts academy. He's a former Special Forces operator who has been training private security contractors and government assets for the past 15 years. Jack felt like the ground was shifting beneath him. Government assets? People who work in situations that officially don't exist. Sarah Martinez has been trained from childhood to operate in scenarios that would break most Special Forces soldiers. The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. What concerns me, Thompson, is that someone with her capabilities is operating without official oversight. Someone who can do what she did during that exercise and what she's done in these civilian incidents represents a significant security interest. Jack was struggling to process the information. Sir, what exactly are you asking me to do? The colonel turned back to face him. I want you to get close to her, find out what she's really capable of, who trained her, and whether she represents a threat to national security. You want me to spy on her? Jack asked, his voice betraying his discomfort. I want you to assess her. There's a difference. Jack thought about Sarah, about the dinner they had shared and the story she had told him about her mother's death. The idea of deceiving her felt wrong on multiple levels. Sir, with respect, Sergeant Martinez is a decorated soldier with a clean record. Isn't this a bit of an overreaction? The colonel's expression hardened. Thompson, someone with her skills could infiltrate any military installation, eliminate high-value targets, and disappear without a trace. The fact that she's been doing good deeds as a civilian doesn't change the security implications. What about her constitutional rights, her privacy? She gave up certain privacy rights when she enlisted, just like you did, and if she's as innocent as you seem to think, then this assessment will clear her record, and she'll never know it happened. Jack realized he didn't have much choice in the matter. Orders were orders, even when they left a bitter taste. How long do I have? 2 weeks. Get close to her, gain her trust, and find out what she's really capable of. I want a full assessment of her training, her capabilities, and her psychological profile. That evening, Jack called Sarah to ask if she wanted to grab coffee. As they sat in a quiet cafe near base, he found himself studying her with new eyes. Everything the colonel had told him seemed to fit. The way she carried herself, the constant awareness of her surroundings, the controlled way she moved despite her injury. "You're quiet tonight," Sarah observed. "Everything okay?" Jack forced a smile. "Just thinking about work stuff. Nothing important." Sarah tilted her head slightly, and Jack realized she was reading his body language with the same precision she had demonstrated during the training exercise. "Jack," she said quietly, "is there something you want to ask me?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. For a moment, he wondered if she somehow knew about his meeting with the colonel. "I was just wondering about your father's academy. You mentioned that he trains security contractors. What kind of training exactly?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jack could see her weighing how much to reveal. "Close protection, counter-surveillance, extraction techniques, advanced medical training," she said finally. "Basically, anything someone might need to know to keep themselves or others alive in dangerous situations. And he taught all of this to you? From the time I could walk, I was learning something. By the time I was 12, I could field dress a gunshot wound and disable an armed attacker twice my size." Jack tried to keep his expression neutral, but inside he was amazed. The colonel's intelligence was accurate. Sarah was far more than a regular soldier. "That's impressive," Jack said carefully. "Have you ever had to use those skills outside of military service?" Sarah's eyes sharpened slightly. "Why do you ask?" Jack realized he was walking into dangerous territory. Sarah was clearly intelligent enough to pick up on leading questions. "Just curious. With training like that, I imagine you could handle yourself pretty well in any situation." Sarah studied his face for several seconds before answering. "I've been in a few situations where my training came in handy, but I try to avoid conflict when possible." "What kind of situations?" "The kind where people pick on those who can't defend themselves." Jack felt a chill as he realized she was referring to the incidents in the colonel's photos. She wasn't denying involvement, she was practically confirming it. "That sounds like you've appointed yourself some kind of vigilante," Jack said, trying to keep his tone light. Sarah's expression hardened slightly. "I prefer to think of it as being a good citizen. When you see someone being hurt and you have the ability to help, you help. It's that simple." Jack nodded, but internally he was taking notes. Sarah's moral code was clear. She would intervene when she saw injustice, regardless of the potential consequences to herself. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Sarah suddenly grabbed Jack's arm. "Don't turn around, but we're being followed." Jack felt his blood pressure spike. "What?" "Two men in dark clothing. They've been watching us for the past 20 minutes. One is by the magazine rack, the other is at the corner table." Jack started to turn his head, but Sarah's grip tightened. "I said don't turn around. Just trust me." "What do you want to do?" Sarah was already calculating options. "We're going to leave through the back exit. There's an alley that connects to the parking structure. If they follow us, we'll know for sure." As they walked toward the back of the cafe, Jack's mind was racing. Were these men connected to the colonel's investigation? Were they watching Sarah, or both of them? "Stay close to me," Sarah whispered as they pushed through the back door into the alley. Jack had barely stepped outside when everything erupted into chaos. Two men emerged from behind a dumpster, moving toward them with obvious hostile intent. In the dim light of the alley, Jack could see that they were armed. "Well," Sarah said calmly as she positioned herself between Jack and the attackers, "this just got interesting." Jack's medical training kicked in as adrenaline flooded his system, but before he could even process what was happening, Sarah was already moving. Despite her injured arm, she flowed toward the first attacker with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. The first man lunged at her with what appeared to be a knife, but Sarah sidestepped the attack and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the brick wall. The sound of his head hitting the concrete echoed through the alley. The second attacker tried to circle around to get at Jack, but Sarah intercepted him with a series of strikes that were too fast for Jack to follow. Within seconds, both attackers were on the ground, groaning and thoroughly defeated. "Stay down," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made both men freeze despite their pain. Jack stared in shock. The entire encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, and Sarah had neutralized 2 armed attackers while protecting him and managing her own injury. It was like watching a movie, except this was absolutely real. Sarah quickly searched both men, removing weapons and checking for identification. "No IDs, no wallets," she reported. "Professional." "Professional what?" Jack managed to ask. "That's what we need to find out." Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911, but Jack could see her mind working through other possibilities. While they waited for police to arrive, Sarah kept both attackers under control with an ease that was almost casual. Jack realized that this was what Colonel Morrison had been talking about. Sarah was operating on a level that went far beyond normal military training. "Sarah," Jack said quietly, "who do you think sent these guys?" Sarah looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. "That's a very interesting question, Jack, and the fact that you're asking it makes me wonder about a few things." Before Jack could ask what she meant, police sirens filled the alley. Within minutes, the area was swarming with officers, paramedics, and military police from the base. The next few hours were a blur of questioning, statements, and paperwork. The attackers were arrested but refused to say anything beyond demanding lawyers. Jack found himself separated from Sarah during the questioning process, which gave him time to think about what had just happened. When they were finally released, it was nearly midnight. Sarah had been quiet throughout the police interviews, but Jack could tell she was processing everything that had occurred. "Want to grab a drink?" Jack asked as they walked to their cars. "I think we both could use one." Sarah studied his face in the parking lot lights. "Sure, but I picked the place." She led him to a 24-hour diner about 10 miles from the base, the kind of place where truckers and night shift workers went for coffee and anonymity. They took a booth in the back, away from the few other customers. "All right," Sarah said once they had ordered coffee. "Let's talk about what's really going on here." Jack felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I mean that attack wasn't random. Those men were watching us specifically, and they were prepared for confrontation. Someone sent them." Jack tried to look confused, but Sarah continued before he could speak. "And you asking me about my background? About situations where I've had to use my training? That wasn't casual conversation either." Jack realized that trying to deceive Sarah was probably impossible. Her training had clearly included reading people and detecting deception. "Sarah, I can explain." "I'm sure you can. The question is whether you're going to tell me the truth or a story that someone else wants me to hear." Jack looked into her eyes and made a decision that he knew might end his military career. "Someone in command knows about the incidents in San Antonio, Dallas, and outside Fort Hood. They have photos." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Jack could see her processing this information. "And they want you to get close to me to find out what I'm capable of," she continued. "How did you—" "Because that's what I would do if I were them. Send someone I trust, someone who has legitimate reason to spend time with me, someone who can report back on my capabilities and psychological profile." Jack felt like he had been completely outmaneuvered. "You've known all along?" "I suspected after you asked about my father's academy. The questions were too specific, too directed, but I wasn't sure until tonight." Jack leaned back in the booth, feeling defeated. "So what happens now?" Sarah sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "That depends on what you tell me. Are you working for someone who sees me as a threat, or someone who might be interested in what I can do?" "I honestly don't know." Colonel Morrison seemed concerned about security implications, but after what I witnessed tonight, I think there might be more to it than that. Sarah nodded. "There usually is." The question is whether your Colonel Morrison is one of the good guys or not. Before Jack could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression hardened. We need to go. Now. What's wrong? That text is from my father. It's a code we established years ago. It means someone is asking questions about me and my training. They left the diner quickly, and Sarah drove them to a motel on the outskirts of town. She paid cash for a room and made several phone calls while Jack tried to process everything that was happening. My father has contacts throughout the intelligence community, Sarah explained when she finished her calls. According to him, someone has been asking detailed questions about my background and capabilities, not military intelligence. Someone else. Jack felt a chill. The attackers tonight? Probably connected, yes, which means this is bigger than just your Colonel Morrison wanting to assess a potentially dangerous soldier. Sarah's phone rang, and she answered it immediately. Jack could only hear her side of the conversation, but her expressions told him it wasn't good news. That was my father, she said when she hung up. Someone broke into the academy tonight. They didn't steal anything, but they went through all his files. Jack was beginning to understand the scope of what they were dealing with. Sarah, what exactly are you capable of? I mean, what's your full training? Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. My father trained me in every combat discipline he could find, but more than that, he connected with other trainers, former Delta Force operators, ex-CIA agents, retired Mossad officers. I've been trained by some of the most dangerous people in the world. She paused, then continued. By the time I was 16, I could infiltrate secure facilities, eliminate targets silently, extract information from unwilling subjects, and disappear without leaving evidence. I chose to enlist in the regular military because I wanted to serve my country, not because I needed the training. Jack stared at her. You're basically a one-person special forces unit. More than that, I'm a one-person intelligence operation, and apparently someone has figured that out. Jack's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Colonel Morrison. Thompson, where are you? We need to talk immediately. Sir, it's after midnight. I don't care what time it is. There's been a development. Meet me at my office in 30 minutes. Jack looked at Sarah after hanging up. He wants to see me now. Sarah shook her head. You're not going alone. If someone is playing games, I want to know who and why. He's not going to want you there. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. He doesn't have a choice. They arrived at the base together, but Sarah stayed in the car while Jack went into the building. Colonel Morrison was waiting in his office, along with two men in civilian clothes who looked like they belonged in a government agency. Thompson, the colonel said without preamble, we have a problem. Sergeant Martinez isn't just a security concern. She's potentially a valuable asset that other parties are trying to acquire. One of the civilian men stepped forward. I'm Agent Davis, CIA. We've been tracking a group that specializes in recruiting individuals with unique capabilities for private military contracts. They've been watching Sergeant Martinez for months. Jack felt the pieces clicking together. The attack tonight? Was probably a recruitment attempt that went wrong. These people don't take no for an answer, and they're not above using coercion. Agent Davis continued. What we need to know is whether Sergeant Martinez would be interested in legitimate government work that would utilize her full capabilities. Jack thought about Sarah waiting in the car. What kind of work? The kind that officially doesn't exist. Deep cover operations, asset recruitment, problem-solving in situations where conventional military action isn't possible. Colonel Morrison leaned forward. Thompson, we need you to present this opportunity to her. She trusts you. Jack almost laughed at the irony. Sir, she knows I've been assessing her. She figured it out. The three men exchanged glances. Agent Davis spoke first. How much does she know? Everything. She's been reading me like a book since day one. Then bring her in. If she's as good as we think she is, she'll want to hear what we have to offer. Jack returned to the car where Sarah was waiting patiently. Well? she asked. They want to meet with you. Officially this time. Sarah considered this. CIA? How did you... Because this whole situation has CIA written all over it. The question is whether they want to recruit me or eliminate me as a threat. Jack looked at her serious expression. Only one way to find out. They walked into the building together. And Jack couldn't help but notice how Sarah carried herself. Despite everything that had happened, despite being outnumbered and potentially walking into a trap, she moved with absolute confidence. The meeting with Colonel Morrison and Agent Davis lasted 2 hours. They laid out everything: the intelligence about the private military group, the potential threats to Sarah and her father, and the opportunity to work in situations where her unique skills would serve national interests. Sarah listened without interrupting, asked pointed questions about command structure and operational parameters, and generally impressed everyone in the room with her understanding of the complex political and military implications. "I'll need to discuss this with my father," she said finally. "And I want full disclosure about what you know about me and my background." Agent Davis nodded. "That's fair. But I should warn you that the private military group isn't going to give up. They see you as a valuable asset, and they have resources that go beyond what you encountered tonight." Sarah stood up, and Jack noticed that she had unconsciously positioned herself where she could see all exits and had clear lines of movement to any potential threats. "Agent Davis," she said, "I've been dealing with people who want to use me for their own purposes since I was 7 years old. The difference between you and them is that you're asking instead of trying to take." She looked at Jack. "What about you? Are you part of this offer?" Jack realized that his answer would determine not just his professional future, but potentially his personal one as well. "If you'll have me as a partner, yes. After what I've seen, I think we make a good team." Sarah smiled, and for the first time since the training exercise, it was completely genuine. "In that case, Agent Davis, you have my attention. Let's talk about how we're going to solve this problem." As they began discussing operational details, Jack realized that his life had just taken a dramatic turn. He had started this assignment thinking he was assessing a potentially dangerous soldier. Instead, he had discovered someone who might just be the most capable person he had ever met. And somewhere in the midst of all the danger and deception, he had fallen for her completely. 6 months later, Jack and Sarah were working as a team for a joint military CIA task force that handled situations requiring their unique combination of skills. Sarah's father had become an unofficial consultant for the program, and the private military group that had been pursuing her had been dismantled through a series of operations that officially never happened. Jack had learned to trust Sarah's instincts completely, and Sarah had learned to let someone else watch her back for the first time in her life. Their partnership had become both professional and personal, built on a foundation of mutual respect and absolute trust. The injury that had brought them together had healed completely, but the scar remained as a reminder of the day everything changed. Neither of them regretted the path that had led them to this point. Though they sometimes marveled at how a single training exercise had revealed so much about who they really were. In the end, Sarah had shocked everyone not just with her capabilities, but with her heart. She was someone who would always choose to protect others, regardless of the personal cost. And Jack had discovered that sometimes the most important mission is simply finding the right person to share it with.